Good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. Thank you for joining our live stream today about digital transformation. My name is Eric Kimberling here with several guests who I'm going to introduce in just a moment. But before I do, just a couple logistical items. First of all, today's topic is change management lessons from an active digital transformation. So we have a change management consulting team here with me today that I'll introduce in a moment that's going to unpack a sort of in progress case study of a digital transformation and some of the change management and change factors that go into that transformation. Before we introduce our guests, though, just a couple logistical items. We are streaming live to LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. So thanks for joining today, wherever you're joining from. We encourage you to ask questions along the way. So I've got a few questions to get us started, but I really encourage the audience to jump in with questions in the chat box. Whatever platform you're listening or watching on, I'm watching the chat stream, so we'll get whatever questions you submit. We'll see it here live as we're recording. Secondly, this live stream is going to be part of our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast. So you're getting to be part of the live production of the podcast. This interview becomes part of the full episode that comes out a week from tomorrow. So be sure to check out that podcast if you don't already subscribe. It's called Transformation Ground Control. It also premieres on these same 4 platforms that we're streaming to today, as well as all the audio podcast platforms as well. So be sure to subscribe to that show if you don't already. And then just to get us started, before I introduce our guests, if you could just drop in the chat where you're joining from today. What city and country are you in? We tend to get a global audience, and we tend to have a global perspective on these digital transformation topics. So we'd love to hear where everyone's joining from here today. If you don't mind just dropping that in the chat so we can see where everyone's from today. This is, again, a weekly live stream that we do same time, same place every Tuesday. So be sure to join us wherever you're watching here today. Be sure to join us weekly for different transformation topics. And again, today's topic is change management lessons from an active digital transformation. And with me today, I have Nathan Stroher, Cameron Carpenter, and Mitch Otteson, all from Third Stage Consulting. So Nate, I'll start with you. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Eric. I'm Nate Stroher, and I'm a practice lead here at Third Stage Consulting, and have spent most of my career in IT and specifically around digital transformation and change management, and work on a lot of our change management clients here at Third Stage.
Great. Well, thanks for being here. And then Cameron Carpenter, thank you for being here as well.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having me. Cameron Carpenter. I'm a consultant at Third Stage Consulting Group. I have a unique background. I have a more operational experience in the Air National Guard with over 12 years in maintenance, repair, and overhaul side. I bring that unique experience and my entrepreneurial experiences to Third Stage, driving digital transformation efforts. There's software selections, change management initiatives, you name it. I'm a delivery consultant. I'm hitting the ground running on these projects. So as you can see, I'm the guy in the deep in the weeds, as you will, day to day, and drive your projects to success. So quick, but enough about me.
Great. Well, thanks for being here, Cameron. And then last but not least, Mitch Otteson. Thank you for joining today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So Mitch Otteson, I'm manager of strategy and transformation here at Third Stage. My background really has I've been in IT, and where I've spent most of my career has been walking the line between business and technology and figuring out how technology can be an enabler for business. And it's something I'm passionate about and look forward to talking about it today.
Great. Well, great to have you all. Thanks for being here. And speaking of topics we're passionate about, I think we can all agree that we're passionate about change management. So we wanted to take this case study, which is interesting in a lot of ways, because a lot of times on this show and on this podcast, we'll sort of do case studies after the fact. After the project's completed, you look back and reflect on what went well, what didn't go well, what were some of the lessons learned. But this one's a little bit different because we're right in the midst of the transformation right now. So it's a little bit more of a in the trenches sort of a feel. And that's really what I wanted to get after here today. And today's discussion is sort of the good, the bad, the ugly of what's happening right now, as you guys are going through this transformation with our client. So I guess just to start out, and we can't, obviously, hopefully the audience understands we can't share the client name or any sort of confidential information, but we can share a bit about the organization, some of the challenges and that sort of thing without mentioning them by name or without giving away who the organization is. But without giving away who the organization is, Nate, tell us a little bit about the client, what it is they do, what industry they're in, that sort of thing, as well as the scope of their digital transformation, just to start us off, and then we'll kind of get into some of the change management specific questions.
Great. Yeah, thanks. Our client is a $1 billion plus multinational chemical manufacturing organization, and they called us in the middle of the implementation of a tier 1 ERP platform. They have had several technology initiatives that have been very successful, some that have been very challenging. We were called in specifically for our change management expertise and to help guide them through the change management initiative and to really put in place a structured change management program and initiative to help them not only with this technology implementation, but down the road, post-implementation, go live and post-go live support.
Okay, great. That's a good overview. And so I guess just to start, again, coming at this from a change management and a human side of change perspective, how big of an impact or change is this transformation in general having on the organization? And Cameron, let's start with you. I know you guys all have opinions on all these topics, but we'll start with you, Cameron.
Well, I'd say that this organization is experiencing a pretty large impact globally. It's a large solution. It's moving from an on-prem to cloud-based. There's a lot of difference in the way the system is structured and handles their current processes. So it's just very complex. There's a lot of moving pieces. And like I said, global, meaning you're working with different countries with different compliance and regulatory requirements and needs, potentially different processes. And to work and manage a project of that size truly takes a strong governance structure from a project perspective in managing it. So it's a significant change to this organization.
And is that the sort of, just out of curiosity, is that that sort of project governance or the general governance that you're talking about? Is that something that's new to this organization, or is that something they already had the competency and now they're just sort of building on that to make the transformation more successful?
I'd say it's a little of both. It seems that they set up the governance structures typically for their projects, but I think they've made a different focus on this one with having the change management lens. They've kind of usually been a technical driven company, and that kind of ties into the culture, right? It's where they've been. And so when Nate alluded to some of the project successes they've had and some of the we won't call them letdowns because they were successful, but as far as they completed them, but they were IT driven and they didn't have a business focus. So I think that's the key with the new governance structure, along with the fact that they've taken those past experiences and have realized the benefit of change management or change leadership, which I'm sure we'll get into a little more. And that's now a new component to this, where we're working with both the technical and the business side.
Got it. Okay. That makes total sense. So Nate and Mitch, anything you'd add to the mix as far as how big of a change or impact this has been on the organization?
The one thing that I would add in there is, coming from an environment where they have their legacy system that was completely customized to meet their needs to the out of the box type of model, they're running into significant challenges in trying to fit what they've been doing for the last 10, 12, 20 years into what they're doing today with an out of the box solution. So lots of processes that we need to be reviewing, evaluating, understanding what you're doing today and what you're trying to accomplish tomorrow.
And
right.
The one thing I'll add, and Cam hit on it a little bit, but I'll elaborate on it. And Eric, I think you could attest to this as well. We're seeing so many folks and so many organizations that are interested in change management, change leadership initiatives, because traditionally IT projects, platform implementations, any digital transformation has been driven and almost exclusively performed by the IT department. And our client has really seen some of the pitfalls and some of the challenges that have come out of that in the past. And this is really a chance for them to get the organization involved. And we're going to hit on this later down in our discussion, I'm sure, but it's really trying to get people to say, you know, this is something we need your input and we need you to be involved. And you can't just say lift and shift and we'll train you how to use this platform. You need to be involved in setting this up and you need to be involved in the change from the beginning.
Yeah, great point. So to address some of these challenges that you guys have mentioned as far as the impact or the change to the organization, what if we just sort of back up or start at the highest level here and work our way down into the details, what's the general change strategy in particular for this digital transformation? What sort of approach are we taking, or how did we get started? That might be a good place to start. What are your thoughts on that, Mitch?
Yeah, so really we got started, and our whole goal when we first engaged with the client was to just understand where they're at. And our change management strategy has really been to meet the client where they're at and to help to identify any pitfalls that we're seeing on where they're going, and to make the deliverables that we're putting in front of them relevant. We talked with some of their experience. I mean, they're a large company. They've worked with Big Four and basically any consultancy out there. And what's been different about us and our strategy has been we're not shoving a methodology down their throat. We are really trying to understand them, navigate their people. We're trying to navigate their structures, and we're trying to meet them where they are and to just help them along the way.
Yeah, great point. I think a lot of organizations and project teams forget that or just intentionally ignore where they're at. They sort of focus on, let's get to the future state. We know we're going to change our culture. We know we're going to change our way of doing business, which is partially true, but you have to understand where you're starting from in order to get there. So that's a really good observation or point. How about Cam or Nate, anything to add in terms of the general, sort of the general change strategy in addition to meeting the client where they are today and helping them start to migrate to where they're headed?
Nate, want to go first?
Yeah, and I'll just say that I think, I think to elaborate with what Mitch said is change management. You have a structure to every project, and I always go back to the difference with when you go to a platform implementation. It's a very set standard. You do this, you do this, you do this. It's very linear. The steps are really well known. Change management's a little bit different. So you come in with a structure, where you are, what steps you need to take, and the programs that you need to implement. But it's a constantly changing and it's constantly shifting to the needs of the client and to the strengths and to the comfort level of the client. So while we come into a project like the one we're on now, we know, like I would say, I'd use the analogy of building a house. We know the steps you need to take to build a house, but you're going to be working with the client throughout the project to adjust the intricacies of what you're doing to meet what their needs are. So it's not just a one size fits all solution.
Yeah, and maybe one of you could talk just real quickly about how we go about ascertaining some of these strengths and weaknesses of a current situation and helping define the change strategy in the form of that organizational readiness assessment. Could one of you maybe just sort of elaborate on that step in our process a little bit? How do we get that foundation or that clear strategy and plan based on that spirit of meeting the client where they are today, but also understanding where they're headed in the future? Could one of you maybe unpack that or just describe at a high level what that organizational readiness assessment is and how that fits into what you're talking about here?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that one. Just things that we do in an assessment like this is to try and bucket observations into themes. And by taking these themes and applying a broad strategy to a theme, we're able to take a pretty broad abstract topic and turn it in. When we're talking with our client, we often try to identify things such as resistance, but there's multiple types of resistance. There's intentional and unintentional, and you tackle those things differently based on whether or not someone is resisting the change because they just don't like the product at all, they weren't included, or maybe it's unintentional being a detractor, and we need to help to guide them along. And it's a change in approach based on where each one of those changes falls into those buckets of themes.
Yeah. Yeah. And generally we get to those themes, or we conclude those themes based on sort of a two-prong change readiness assessment, where we go in and we do online anonymous surveys, but we also do qualitative focus groups. And then during that data gathering, quantitative and qualitative data gathering, and we use that input to then analyze, to understand what are the nuances of this particular organization compared to others that we work with, and what are the pitfalls that this organization is going to face, and ultimately what is the most effective change strategy and plan that we can tailor for this particular situation. So I think that, that upfront assessment piece really gets to the heart of what you guys are saying, which is so important, which is to sort of frame this, or to create a strategy and plan that is not one size fits all, but is more specific to a client's particular situation.
Yep.
Just real quickly, before I get to more questions here, I want to get over to the audience here real quickly, just to give a shout out to some of the people joining from all over the world. We have VJ on LinkedIn that's joining us from Hyderabad, India. Georgiana from the UK, and Clevedon. I apologize, I'm not familiar with that city in the UK, but thank you for joining here today. Kyler, my podcast host, is joining us here in Denver, where 3 of the 4 of us are based here today. Mohammed on LinkedIn from Saudi Arabia, Reddy from Saudi Arabia, Reina from Denver, Colorado, Nat from Thailand. We have someone from Pakistan, Germany, India, Argentina, Atlanta, India, Atlanta again, Bangladesh, India. So thank you everyone for joining all over the world. Really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, or as you think of questions, please drop those in the chat. We'd love to get to those questions that you have as well, as we get going here in the conversation. Here's a question actually from the audience that I wanted to get to, which is sort of builds on what we were just talking about, how you tailor some of these change strategies and solutions for a specific client situation. But it also gets into another sort of subtopic or thread within that discussion of, the pitfalls of initial implementation being IT driven versus business driven. And this is from Wilson over on YouTube, who asked the question here. And I suppose it's not really a question. I'm not sure if it's meant to be a question, but maybe I'll turn it into a question if it's not. But what are some of those IT-driven pitfalls versus business-driven pitfalls that you guys have seen, at least with this particular situation? And actually, I'm going to come back to another question related to this as it relates to sort of standard software functionality versus the way the business wants to operate. I'm going to come back to that as well. But what are some of the pitfalls of an implementation like this being IT-driven versus business-driven? Is this a challenge that we've seen with this client, or what are your thoughts here? Why don't we start with you, Cam?
Yeah, so from what I see with this client, because they have been strong in IT focus in their past projects, they're focused more on the business side now. So what's been positive might not be quote unquote a pitfall, right? Is that there's business focus, but still with consulting and the technical side. So you might get a technical perspective of, there's going to be a process change and you're going to need to train some people on this. It's not a big deal. But then when you switch gears and look at it from a business perspective, there's the pitfall, is they don't see it from a cultural perspective, organizationally, and what it really means truly to the end users. So to me, for this specific case study, it's the fact that we're fortunate to have the business lens to tie back to what we might not get from the technical folks. There's some gaps, and that's the fluffy stuff, right? That we tend to talk about, that people they don't want to talk about and work with for organizations, but it's true, and it definitely is impactful.
Yeah, makes total sense. How about you, Nate? Anything you'd add to that?
Well, I would just say that ultimately the platform and the technology is in place to solve a business solution, or solve a business problem, or provide a solution to the business. So I think it's really important. And I think the pitfall when you have either the business driving it too much or IT driving the process too much is that you lose that collaboration. IT is really good at knowing what the system can do, what the capabilities, what the functionality is, how you configure the system. The business is really good at knowing what they need to do and what they need from the technology to help them do their job. So again, if either way, if you have one side that's too heavy on the teeter-totter IT or business, you're going to get out of whack. So it's really making sure that collaboration's there so that the business can provide what their needs are, IT can provide what the solution is. Those come together and they really give you the ultimate best solution.
What about, Mitch, maybe I'll start with you on this question. What about this whole concept of, the standard functionality of the software? Every system, whether it's this one that this client is implementing or any other ERP system out there, or any sort of enterprise technology, you have sort of your standard workflows or a standard way the software works. And then you have the way the organization works today. And then you have sort of the future state of how that organization is going to work using that new technology in the future. Maybe explain to us or help us understand how has this dynamic worked with this particular client? What have some of the challenges been in terms of just reconciling the way software works versus way organization works today versus way organization wants to work in the future? Maybe help us unpack that a little bit if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So, this client has been, and has an extra dimension to it in the fact that they're working with their software provider on co-innovation. So they're meeting and creating a product that is specific for the chemical manufacturing space. And so there's an additional layer to that where with, a lot of our clients traditionally, we look at what does the software do today? How does that fit your business processes and needs? Where are there gaps? And can that gap be solved for with an additional workflow that's something that's an out-of-the-box tool within the software to accomplish things that maybe aren't right out of the box, but it's not a customization. You aren't changing the underlying code. You're just changing some of the workflows within it using the tools provided. And then from there, you decide, does this need a customization or do we need to modify our business processes to meet the additional complexity here is that a lot of the software that comes out of the box inherently doesn't meet chemical manufacturing where it's at. That's the purpose of co-innovation, is to try and bridge those gaps. So it's trying to understand, is this a change that the client needs to make? Is it a change they need to? Is the vendor willing and able to make those changes and do it in a way that satisfies the needs of the business? So this one has been kind of like navigating a minefield and trying to just understand where is it right to spend resources, where should the processes change, and where should we ask for code to support the processes. And it really goes to understanding what's core to what we do, what is our differentiators, what are our secret sauce, for lack of a better term, and how can we support the things that make our business unique and successful.
So how, Nate, I'll ask you this, how successful or how open to what Mitch just described, how open has this particular client been to that approach, or how has that played out in actuality? I mean, what Mitch just said makes total sense. I completely agree. But then there's the reality of it's usually a little bit messier. It's a little bit messier than that. But how has it been with this particular client? Are they finding that navigating that balance of, leveraging workflows out of the system versus changing things of the system that they need to change? How are they navigating that? How would you describe the way they're going about that?
Well, I think, and this is interesting, and we just had this discussion yesterday on one of our status update calls. But I think as the client's getting more and more familiar with the process, and as they're starting to see some benefits and some buy-in, for lack of a better phrase, they're starting to buy into the process. So I think change. I think is while change is a subject is everywhere in our life, I think change management to an organization is fairly foreign. So I think where we're seeing a lot of the success with this client, and where we've seen it with a lot of our clients, is the fact that as you start to take those baby steps and you start to include them and you start to talk about the cross-functional changes and the organizational changes they'll be seeing, and they'll be encountering over the next 6 months, year plus, they're starting to buy into it, and they're starting to get open to it. So there's that gray area, and it's that gray area of literally to the point where sometimes you'll start off and they say, why are we even doing this? Let's just implement the software. let's just use the functionality that's there, let's not worry about it, to, hey, I have buy-in on this, I make a difference, you're listening to what my business needs are, to where they really become an integral part of this configuration and this implementation. So it's definitely one, and I don't think this is unique to our client today, where the more and more they start to see results, and the more and more they start to become involved, the more they open up, and it's really a cool thing to see throughout the process. Is it really starts to build momentum, and it's going to be building more and more momentum as we go forward.
Yeah, I know we see with a lot of our clients this refrain from executives who say, we don't want to customize the software at all. Let's do zero customization. Let's just deploy the software as it was built out of the box. And I guess the good news in that is that it's because executives and organizations in general are starting to realize, and they've realized over recent years and decades, that customization oftentimes can lead to failure, and it leads to a lot of risk and cost overruns and all that stuff. So that's the good news. At least it's coming from a good place. But the reality is that you can't just draw a line in the sand and say, we are not customizing the software, we're just using it out of the box, especially if it's a enterprise-wide technology like a big tier 1 ERP system. There's just no way those systems can be everything to everyone. So I think that challenge is difficult for a lot of organizations, because I think they have in their minds, it's sort of like one or the other. We're either going to customize or we're not, when in the reality is that you've got to find the right balance for you, and you might come up with different answers and different conclusions based on different parts of your business and the secret sauce of your business, like you said, Mitch, and all that good stuff. So those are really good points. What about this question here from Kyler, who is our podcast host here, listening and joining in the background here? How do you address that change trauma in these types of large global organizations? If something went poorly in the past, I assume employees might be more hesitant to embrace new processes or technologies? ? I see you guys all nodding here, so this should be an interesting response for this particular client. Is this something that resonates with this client? What are your thoughts, Cameron? Is it something that sounds familiar?
Well, yes. And part of that is the fact that most of their past projects have obviously been IT driven. So when we are discussing and talking, it's really trying to take them along the journey to coach and train them on the change process and what it means, and to create that feedback loop, so that when we're hearing from the business and from those key folks that have experienced change trauma in the past, right, that it's getting to the proper folks within the governance structure of the project and escalated in the appropriate manner, so that their voices are being heard. So I think that's the key, right? The business is a part of this, and there is a structure in place to communicate and work through the changes and escalate them as necessary. So definitely you see it here. And the positive is because the business is involved and they're passionate, they're going to speak up, because it impacts them and it impacts their people. So that's it might be quote unquote trauma, but they're involved and they're a part of it. So I think that's key.
Right. Yeah, it makes total sense. And actually, I want to build on that with a follow-up question for you, Mitch. And this is actually coming back to something that you mentioned sort of in passing, but I think is a really good point. And Zishan on LinkedIn has a question here of how would you elaborate on, let's talk about intentional and unintentional resistance. He's just asking about intentional resistance, but let's talk about the difference between the two. And maybe if you could, maybe just give an example of, of what we've seen, especially an example of unintentional resistance, because I think that's the one that creeps up on you and surprises you in a lot of changes. Yeah. But how would you describe that difference to start?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, intentional resistance, I view it as someone who just is not bought into the change. They don't understand the need for the change. They've been doing this process this way for years, and they're comfortable with it. And with the intentional resistance, it's very clear and very easy to pick up on, hey, this person is really not interested in this. They're not bought in. They could either be vocal about it or they can be very shut off about it. But it's usually pretty clear. The unintentional resistance is really the one that creeps in on you. And it's more, I would describe it as discomfort. And you oftentimes pick up on it based on the questions that people are asking. When they're describing a way that a process has been run for such a long time, and how they just can't see how it could ever, but they're doing it in a way that is supportive and comes off as collaborating. And you see that they're really just not bought into what it is that we're doing. It's the same, consequence where the buy-in isn't there, and it's just we need to bridge that gap a little bit more. But it's often a lot more, and so that one's a lot harder to pick up on and to do something about, and often more difficult to address because it's often the people that seem pretty positive about the project, seem pretty positive about what's going on. They're just not bought into the change and how it's going to impact them. And oftentimes it comes from a place of not knowing what the future holds, not knowing how my job is going to change based on this. And so what we try and do to address the unintentional resistance is to give a clear picture, or as clear as we can, on what's changing, why it's changing. The why is huge. But then also sharing a vision for the future. Your manual process that you've been doing this way and takes up 20 hours of your week, you can spend time working on other cool things that you haven't had the time to do that are there. So there's efficiencies that can be gained, and oftentimes people know that there's cool work that they can be doing. They just don't have time to do it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you hit another really good point, which is the unintentional resistance is way harder to detect. And in fact, I'd go even one step further and say it's almost misleading because it's unintentional. And so on the surface, the people or the work groups are on board. They're saying they're on board, and who knows, maybe they really are on board at the idea of change. But then once you start getting into the details of what the change means and how it's going to affect them and how it's going to really rock their worlds, then you start to get the pushback, not because it's coming from a bad place, but because there's fear, there's uncertainty, there's confusion, whatever it is. So that unintentional resistance is a lot more difficult to encounter for sure. Cameron, I'll ask you this question. I don't know if part of me thinks this may not be a fair question, but I have to ask it anyway to see if you have a good answer. But do you have any examples from this particular client of either work groups or individuals that have demonstrated maybe that unintentional resistance, where maybe on the surface they're on board, they're excited, but you get into the change and you start to really push on what the change means and how their processes are going to change or how their job is going to change, and then you start to see pushback. Have you seen any either examples of work groups or individuals where that was prevalent in this particular client?
Yeah, well, yeah, I think so, because initially when you're going through, there's one big specific change impact that just pops up in my head. It's completely changed, like flipping them 180 from the way they do it today. It's in a large part of the organization with the operational side and key part of the business. And so as they're standardizing and pushing to that, initially we're watching the demos and seeing what it's going to be like. But as the project has progressed, there's been more and more frustrations and more involvement with other folks outside of the initial group. And you can see that there's the water cooler talk, and it's kind of transitioning and bubbling up, if you will, right, into something that's more extensive and more global. It's impacting a ton of folks. So I don't know if I encompassed it enough from the intentional perspective, but when it snowballs and it starts little and they're watching and they're on board, and then it's just kept growing and growing, we're seeing from an outside view this, it's the snowball's as big as the house now, right? It's gone to a point of escalation and explosion, if you will. So maybe in the earlier stages.
Yeah, so you see some fires burning or some fires brewing.
Yes.
as it relates to that.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm sure Mitch or Nate could elaborate on that, because everybody's been all hands on deck for conversations around this change impact specifically. Mm-hmm. And they can put it from their lens of what they've seen from their side.
I think the one thing that I would add, and we have, it's one of the predominant work streams within this organization, has been from the beginning. They've had this, it's just a lift and shift mentality. We will literally take the old software, implement the new software. Everyone knows their job. The processes aren't going to change. Everything's really going to be the same, with the exception of some minor changes to the look and feel. as you start to dig into it with this work stream and with this team, you start to say, well, what about this change in functionality? And they, well, yeah, that's right, that is different, and it is different. So it kind of teeters that line between intentional and unintentional resistance. I think sometimes they've talked themselves into, yeah, it's going to be the same. We really don't have anything to worry about, just because that's an easier answer than really digging into it. But once we start to dig into it, they start to say, yeah, there is going to be a lot more change than we expected. And we really almost go through this exercise where we say, let's document what's not going to change and let's document what is going to change, even if it's minor changes to the platform and to the way you do your job. And when you look at that consolidated list of all the different changes and all the different things that won't change, it really opens their eyes to the fact that, yeah, this is a lot more than just putting a new software in place, clicking the button, going live, and we'll do our jobs the way we've done it all the time.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And what sort of change management issues let's start with issues. What sort of change management issues do you think have been the most difficult so far? And I'll start with you, Mitch. When you look at this particular client, what are some of the either the cultural, just organizational, resistance related dynamics? What would have been the most challenge for this particular client?
I think some of the biggest challenges that we've run into so far have come from, again, the co-innovation and not really having a clear picture of what is they are changing to, not being able to speak to why things are changing in that way. So Kyler had a really good question, in the chat about explaining the why of an organization of that size, and I think that really goes hand in hand with some of the challenges. Is things are changing, and sometimes the best explanation for why that has been because they are. And that's really not a good answer. We need to be able to tie the why back into things of this is changing and it is for this reason. If people understand what the change is, they're a lot easier. It's a lot easier for them to get bought in and to get on board. And so our challenge has been communicating that why across the board, and also first understanding the what and then moving into the why. And I think that we're kind of in the middle of that right now. So I think that's one of the big challenges for our team right now, is to position the changes that are coming after we understand the what a little bit better, and make sure that it's coming from answering the what with the why in parallel with that, so that then people are bought in and don't have that unintentional change or hit the water cooler to gripe about things, rather than have a good understanding of the change and why it's happening.
Right.
Yeah. I have to add to that, because I had a thought with what Mitch said is it's challenging for folks that are trying to do their part in the project too, when you have others from the business that are constantly taking up time to focus on one area when it's not their part of the process to escalate changes in that manner, right? So you're dealing with a different type of collaboration internally as well, where we might have an hour session to get through specific topics, and the folks on the call talk about the change impact when it's being standardized, and it's more of an escalatory conversation that needs to go up the chain and needs to be an outside combo. So I think that creates challenges internally with the project as it's ongoing. And also, another key challenge from a change perspective, from what I've seen so far, is because this is global, there are different waves essentially for different businesses that are going to go live, and you're seeing changes impacting one business that will be impacting others. And they're seeing that, and any decisions being made now, with whether design decisions, requirements, processes, there's impact to those other groups, but they're not directly involved in the day-to-day. So that definitely creates a challenge.
Yeah,
sort of the indirect impacts. Is that what you're talking about? Sort of like the downstream impacts or whatever.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there are decisions that are being made that will impact. The challenge that I think Cam was alluding to is, how much is enough involvement and how much is too much involvement. If you have too many cooks in the kitchen, it makes it hard to move at a pace that needs to be moved at for a project like this. If you involved everyone, you could easily really expand the scope and timeline of the projects. So it's figuring out how much is enough involvement to make sure everyone's voice is heard, but that you're able to move at a brisk enough pace.
Maybe 10x for these ones.
Yeah.
So here's another related question from Zam on LinkedIn. And Zam asks, as a change manager, I found it relatively easy to get the top management on board, but the challenge I face is with mid-level and frontline managers to even acknowledge the change that's happening. Any thoughts on how and what approach is best? And we'll start with you, Nate. That's a kind of a strategic question around how to get mid-level management on down. How do you get them on board, assuming the executives are already on board, or at least they're at least paying lip service to the fact that they're on board, if at the very least, let's assume. So how do we get mid-level management on down on board with change?
I think that where we've seen most of our success, and this I think we run into almost with every organization again that we deal with from a change point of view, is just that uncertainty. So where we really have found a lot of success in getting engagement throughout the entire organization is putting together a really focused plan on what the steps are, and not only outlining here's the 5 steps that we're going to take, or here's the 5 areas we're going to focus on change, but really why we're doing them, what's the desired outcome, and what that means to the individual. So getting buy-in at the executive level. Do you agree with all of these steps? Do you agree with what our desired outcome is, how we're going to put them in place, and how we're going to work with your organization? Once you get the executive level, then it's going to the mid-level and the end users, and really getting that buy-in as well. So I don't want to oversimplify it, but I think it really comes down to putting together a very concise and direct plan on how you're going to do it. And again, that plan is going to change within the framework, but really having we're going from here to here to here, and here's why we're doing it, getting buy-in from the end users as far as what the results are that you're going to produce, and really just getting started. And it's like we're finding with this client, getting started, starting to see some results, starting to see some buy-in to the process is going to get that momentum started. But without really a clear outline of what you're doing, a lot of people are going to just build the walls even higher than when you first got there.
Yeah, makes total sense. If we had to back up a bit and maybe come back to just sort of the general trends and lessons here in this particular case study, what are some of, and I'll start with you on this, Nate, on this question too, but what are some of the general change management lessons learned from the project so far? I'd be curious to hear what you all think, but I'll start with you, Nate.
Yeah, and I'll outline 4, and Mitch and Cam, you can jump in or circle back after I briefly introduce them. But I think first and foremost, it's never too late to start a change management engagement. We would have been involved with the client that we're currently working with from the beginning. We were called in about 6 months into this implementation. We had a lot of catching up to do. And a lot of work to really getting ingrained and get ourselves in place, starting with a late start from our side. That being said, it's never too late to start. And what you've learned, and whenever you start your change management engagement, you've already learned a lot about what's worked throughout the organization and what their challenges are. So you really do, even though you're starting late to the game, you're starting with some knowledge of what's worked and some knowledge of what hasn't. Second, I would say is change is an ongoing effort. It's not. This is definitely something that is a dynamic process that you're not only going to be engaged in through go live, but post go live as well. So the one thing we're really learning with this client is, again, we're outlining the steps, we're outlining why we're doing it. But we're also very quick to point out to this client, the answer today might not be the answer tomorrow. It's a sliding scale, and we're really working towards managing the change and managing what's going to be the best for them to take best advantage of the platform we're implementing. And then the last 2, it's this is something that we're not familiar with, and I think Mitch and Cam and I have alluded to this a lot. We're coming into a situation where people are not really comfortable with change management. They're not really familiar with the topic. So it's something that we really, you really need to, again, at every point emphasize what we're doing and what's the desired outcome. And, I think finally the biggest lesson we've learned, and one of the major lessons we're learning and growing with on this engagement, is celebrating what we've accomplished and really taking a stance of what we've accomplished, where we stand, and where we're going, and really starting to celebrate, here's kind of some of the things that we're discovering, here's some of the changes we're seeing, and here's some of the results that are coming from it. So that as people are grinding through this, it's not just a slot, just wading through the marshes, but it's actually saying, hey, we're making progress, and here's where we are on the continual effort going forward.
Yeah. Now, what about, I want to come back to the first one you mentioned, Nate, you playing catch up and us coming in 6 months in. Just help us understand what sort of triggered this client to recognize relatively early. It was later than we'd like, and it wasn't ideal, but client did at some point relatively early in the project realize they needed change management help. And this actually ties to a question that Kyler has as well, which is, what are some of the signs that an organization needs outside change management support? But in this case in particular, what did the client see? What were they seeing or feeling that made them realize that they needed help with change management?
Mitch, do you want to jump in that? I can answer it, but I think you've got a pretty good perspective. I saw you nodding your head there.
Yeah, so I think everyone can benefit in some degree from outside change, just in the fact that you come in with a completely unbiased third-party opinion and observations. So I think the writing is on the wall in some way, shape, or form for just about every organization out there, especially with a project of this magnitude. Like, if you're just in there going and tackling things the way that you have, one's perfect at change management. And so getting a partner to come in and give you that unfiltered opinion and also game plan for how you can tackle some of the challenges, because there will be challenges, is incredibly valuable. So I think that's a really broad answer to that, but I really do believe it's true for just about any organization, at least every single one that I've been engaged with.
And I think to be a little more specific to this client as well, we heard so much, and we're still hearing it today. They just came out of, or I guess they're just coming out of a platform implementation, not an ERP platform, but another technology implementation that they had a lot of challenges. And I think they quickly realized in doing their post implementation analysis that when they addressed the change, they had success. When they let it be driven by the IT group only and not including the business, that's when most of their challenges came forth. So they really are fresh out of, I don't want to call it a failure because it was a successful implementation, but I think there's a lot of battle scars that they're feeling, and they were able to identify the fact that they didn't have a real formal change management or change leadership, as they call it, program in place, and they really saw the need for it. So when they came to us and we outlined, here's what we can do, and they were able to tie that back to some of the success they had. They said, hey, you know what you guys are selling us and what we've seen as success in the past, really they match. So we really can see the value in your solution. Let's get you involved, even though we're starting a little bit late to the game. Let's get you involved because we know that this is an ongoing process, and it's not just a 9-month implementation, but it's an implementation and a post-go live support as well.
Yeah, great point, and great examples there of how that change or the need for change is recognized within this organization. Here's a really long question. It doesn't even fit on the screen, so I'll try to paraphrase it here. Actually, in fact, I'm going to take that away off the screen because the part I showed doesn't really help. So the question here is from LinkedIn. I don't see who it's from, but it's someone on LinkedIn. It says, I'm hoping you guys could share your experiences or advice for someone in a senior leadership role during a digital transformation as part of a new merger and acquisition integration. And the question is, what specifically is the most effective way to address concerns without standing out as a potential roadblock in the transition? For example, if the parent company, the acquiring company, is wholly trusting the ERP consultants and appears to be actively resisting any sort of quality assurance or independent verification, validation. And maybe I'll broaden that question a bit to say, I'll rephrase the question a bit differently, and hopefully it still gets to the heart of what the question is really what they're trying to get at, and that is, how do we go about this change stuff? Knowing, if we back up and we know that the change in the human side of change is going to be the critical path. It's going to be the thing that takes the longest or one of the longer activities in a work stream, not because we're not good at change management, not because no one wants to change necessarily, but just because changing humans takes a lot longer typically than throwing in new technology. So how can we frame, as change management practitioners or even just a transformation team, how can we frame change management as something that's not a roadblock or an obstacle to changing, and not something that slows us down, but something that actually speeds us up, if that makes sense? I think that is the heart of what this person, I think, is asking in terms of the M&A integration example. What are your thoughts? Maybe any one of you that might have an immediate thought there.
Yeah, I would say, this question did come from a senior leadership perspective. And I think in that, the advice that I would give, and something that we always try and do, at least I do personally whenever we're engaged in this, from a place of trying to build trust. Since it is such a human-centric thing that is change management, building that trust is an integral part. And if you don't have that trust, there's going to be resistance, both intentional and unintentional. So starting from a place of understand, then build that trust with both sides, the parent and the child organizations. Trust on both sides will allow you to navigate what those changes are, and you are slowing down. I think it's okay to acknowledge that you're slowing down, but you're slowing. I had a manager who used to say, slow down to speed up. And you're getting better at what you're doing, and it enables you to go faster in the long run. But right now we are slowing down. We're taking our time, and we're taking a thoughtful approach to how we're handling this, because if we speed through it, it's going to jeopardize the rest of what we're trying to build and accomplish. And I think labeling and identifying that and being okay with that, and coming from a place of building trust is a great way to navigate that.
Yeah, and it seems like, I think, first of all, you have to recognize what you're going fast towards. I think a lot of times organizations think, well, this change management stuff, it slows us down. We're worried too much about people. We should just be building technology. Well, the reality is, in that case, yes, you're moving quickly, but you're moving really quickly towards a cliff, and you're about to go off that cliff. So change. Yeah. You could argue that change management is an obstacle, or it's slowing down your change. Well, I guess you could say that, but it's keeping you off from jumping off a cliff. I mean, why not nudge the organization in a direction that's actually going to be a lot more productive and of benefit longer term? I think that's really the question. I would kind of spin that question into that follow-up thread there.
Well, and the thing is how do you if you don't package and understand the change and then develop action planning around it, you get to okay, we put it in and we go live. Now what? You drop support, you don't work with your folks. Now they start creating workarounds. They don't adopt the change. They're going to try to get the work done however possible. And now you potentially cause more heartache and pain, because you're going to have to come in and try to work through those. And those pains and those workarounds and those issues following post go live can trickle to customers. It can trickle out to other folks, which could potentially cost you. So I think the go slow to go faster makes sense from a perspective of encompass the change, understand what it is, create proper action planning around it in post go live support. And this is coming from the mindset of somebody who's in the trenches digging and is seeing it, right? It's how we create action around it, right? Not just talk about it, but what we do about it. And that's having support from leadership, senior leaders, and then that messaging, communication, training, engagement that we do within the mid-level to the bottom, right? Senior leaders or strategy, what's the vision, mid-tiers, what are we going to do to manage this, and users, and the lower level tier, how do we do it, right? So it's different levels of engagement.
Yeah. Yeah, it makes total sense. So in the minute or two we have left here, I want to ask sort of a lightning round summary, sort of a question to tie this all together. And I'll start with you on this one, Cameron. But what advice would you give to an organization about to embark on a big change initiative like this one, knowing what you know now and what you learned in this particular case study and others? What advice would you give? How would you summarize the advice you'd give?
Okay, so me overall, it would be to develop a strong governance structure for your project that's tied with your organizational structure. That way you have leadership support from the top down, and ultimately with that, finding folks within the organization that are the right leaders, right? And sometimes you might not be able to find them, but the right leaders are those that are dynamic, flexible. They are knowledgeable across streams, they work streams or functions in the business. They have a vision of the future as well, and they could communicate well with your people. If you don't have that, the advice is to find an organization, a third party or group like Third Stage, for instance, that can come in as a coach, an advisor, and help you through that process, develop your people into those roles in the project. Because sometimes you're going to assign folks and then they might not be really able to handle that position at the current point, but as you coach and work them through it and develop them, they're going to take on that role within the organization in the project, and it's ultimately going to help you to be successful.
Yeah, that's great advice. How about you, Mitch? What would you add?
I would say make the investment up front in understanding where you are at. These projects are often emotional. It's just the nature of them. And so facts kind of help you make sure that things stay unemotional. So understanding your current state with facts, with diagrams, with a really rock solid understanding of where you're at and where you need to go can help you to navigate some of the changes and the emotions that come from the changes. And then, since it's not a perfect science, everyone can be better at change management, even the best change management, or getting that outside perspective is really helpful. And, lean on your support.
Yeah, makes sense. And last but not least, how about you, Nate? What advice would you give to an organization about to start a big change initiative like this one?
I think that the most important, and we've hit on it a little bit here, but I think we see it with every client, and that is you have to have buy-in and you have to have leadership. Leadership needs to drive the change. They can't just go to their organization and say, guys, it's time for you to change. You take this program and you run with it. Leadership has to be involved along with everyone else in the organization to drive the change home. So I think be it a change management project, any implementation, any project, any digital transformation project, the change has to start at the top and it has to be consistent throughout the project.
Yeah, it's great advice. I mean, those are all three really good responses, and this is a topic we could easily spend another hour or two or three talking about. So I really appreciate your guys' time, and we started to scratch the surface, and I suppose that probably means we should do a follow up at some point and go even deeper, or especially once you've gotten a little bit further into the change initiative, just to see what additional lessons learned you have. It'd be interesting to pick that up again later. So want to thank the three of you guys for being on here today. Really appreciate your time. And appreciate all the great feedback and lessons here you're sharing with us. So thank you for that. And thank you to the audience for the great questions and for being here today. You can, again, find this live stream as part of our Transformation Ground Control podcast, which is released a week from tomorrow. Every Wednesday there's new episodes, but this interview will be featured in the episode that comes out a week from tomorrow. Be sure to check us there on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, or any of the audio podcast platforms. And thank you for that. And thank you for the great questions. Hope you all have a great week. And we will see you all next time on the live stream. Have a great week in the meantime. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.